Hey guys, I hope you are having a wonderful day at home. Um, what I want to talk about today is what you think about when you read. So, we've started our first books. You have hopefully gotten a bit of a ways into it. You've been reading for at least a couple days. If you're reading every day at home and you're reading when you have time in class, you should be at least several chapters in, if not more. So I want to start thinking about our reading in some specific ways. So I want to start, let's take a moment. What do you think about when you read? Just stop and think. What goes through your mind when you're reading a book? I bet for some of you, you're saying things like, what's for lunch? Or you're thinking things like, how many pages till the end of the chapter? You might be thinking things like, how long have I been reading? You might think something like, should I check my phone? Others of you might be thinking things like, you're picturing what's happening in the book. You might be asking yourself questions. You might be predicting future events. You might be noticing details in the text, like character details or the way that it's written or something like that. You might be thinking about what you're going to read next. You might be thinking about talking or writing about what you just read. You might be thinking about characters and what they're like. Your opinions. You might be judging those characters. You might be like, wow, that was a terrible decision that character just made. So if we look at these, there may be more things that you were thinking about, but maybe we can kind of categorize these, right? So some of these thoughts are going to be really, really helpful. And some of these thoughts are not going to be super helpful to us, but they are things that pop into our brains because we're humans, and sometimes thoughts pop into our heads without us really having a whole lot of control over it. So sometimes we're going to have thoughts like, what's for lunch? How many pages are left? Should I check my phone? How long have I been reading? Those things are going to happen sometimes. And we're going to want to shift our thinking when that happens. That's going to be a sign to us that we aren't thinking while we're reading, that we're not thinking about the book, we're thinking about something else. So we need to actively decide what we're going to think about, or we need to change up our environment or do something so that we can do some of these more helpful thinking things like picturing the story, asking yourself questions, predicting future events, thinking about the characters, the text, thinking about what you're going to do with what you've read. Are you going to talk to someone? Are you going to write something? What big ideas are you coming up with? Things like that. So one thing that I want you to think about is actually taking the time to consider the book that you're reading. Sometimes, for different reasons, we want to rush through a book. Sometimes we want to rush through the book because it's just so good, we want to keep reading, and that is awesome. If you want to rush through the book because you want to keep reading, that's great. I'm so excited that you have a book that you're so into that you want to rush through it. Sometimes, though, slowing down just a little. So I'm not saying if you would take 2 days to read a book, now you should take 2 weeks. But stopping just occasionally to really consider what you think about the book you're reading, like what's happening, what are your ideas, can make that book even better. Sometimes we don't take the time to consider the book we're reading because we're not super into the book. We don't really care about the book that we're reading. It's not the right story for us. So we want to find a book that we want to care about, that we want to think about. If right now you're reading a book that you have no interest in thinking about, I highly recommend looking for a new book. If you are stuck and you're like, I don't know how to find a book that I like, talk to me. We can look for some recommendations, tell me what stories you have liked in the past, and we'll try out some books and find you a book that you do like and want to hear the ending of. Even if reading is something that doesn't come as naturally to you or you find a bit of a challenge, stories are a very human thing. Humans have always told stories. So we want to find at least a story that you're interested in, and then we can work on the reading part of it. So one way that we can take some time to consider the book you're reading is to stop and ask yourself questions. You don't want to stop all the time because, again, if you're reading a book that you're super into, get through that book. You want to keep going. I want you to turn those pages. I love reading a book I'm super into that I can't wait to find out what happens next. But sometimes when I stop and I ask myself a question, that makes the book so much better and I get even more invested in the story that's unfolding. So I could ask myself questions like, what's going to happen next? That one might just pop into your head automatically. A lot of these questions for some of us might just pop into our heads automatically. And if that's the case for you, that is awesome. If you are not to the point where some of these questions pop into your head automatically, see what happens if you stop and you make yourself ask yourself these questions. What do you think is going to happen next? What do you hope is going to happen next? What do you hope doesn't happen next? Have you seen any hints about what you think is coming? You can ask, like, why did a character do the thing they just did? Was it a good decision? Sometimes characters make terrible choices. And you can stop and you can ask yourself, like, well, was that a good choice or not? I don't know. And you can, like, full on judge characters. I give you full reign to judge characters' choices. You might ask yourself, like, well, what kind of person is this character? This is especially good if you're reading a story with, it's called an unreliable narrator, but it basically means, like, you can't trust the person telling the story. It's a great idea to always keep in mind, like, hey, what kind of person is telling me this story? You might ask yourself, like, well, what would it be like to live in this world? If you read a lot of fantasy, that is a great question to ask yourself. If you like dystopian or sci-fi or fantasy, asking yourself, like, what is this place like? What would it be like if I lived there? Is a great way to really think about the book that you're reading and get yourself way more into the story. You might think about, like, how the character should solve the problem. So you know that in all stories, at least all narratives, characters have a problem that they need to solve, right? So you might think, like, well, how would I solve the problem? What's the right way to solve this problem? Do I think the character will do the right thing? Sometimes characters have really complicated problems where the solution is not easy, and sometimes characters have really simple problems where you know, the solution should be really easy, but sometimes characters, because of their own flaws or their own traits, they make choices that make their problem harder to solve. And that can be something really interesting to think about. You might think about what the writing is like in the book. Do you like the way it's written? Does it sound real? Like when the characters talk to each other, does it sound like people talking to each other? When you read the paragraphs, do you like the way it sounds? Do you find it interesting? Do you find it engaging? Or is it distracting? Are there a bunch of like metaphors and figurative language that you like? Or maybe you find that really confusing and you don't like that at all. So you can think about like, do I like the way this is written? How's it changing the story for me? And you might even ask yourself like, well, what big ideas is this book discussing? What might it be trying to say about the world? So you might ask yourself some big questions, especially when you get later on towards the end of the book. You might be like, what is this book trying to talk about? Like, is it trying to tell me something about the world? And if so, what is it trying to say? For some of us, these questions are natural. They pop into our heads. For some of us, these questions are not at all natural. We haven't practiced using them. They're not things that we are, accustomed to thinking about. But actually asking yourself these questions and taking the time to try to invest yourself in the book you're reading will make the book more interesting. Sometimes people don't love reading because they don't ever get to the point where they're asking themselves these kinds of questions. So really taking the time to really think about the book you're reading can actually make the book better. It can totally change your experience with the book. So think about purposefully going out of your way to ask some of these questions while you are reading today, and see how does it add to your experience of reading the book? Are you more interested to continue because you stopped and asked some of these questions? A couple other things you can do to help consider what you are reading. You can talk about what you're reading. Tell friends or family about your thoughts. This is especially good if they have already read the book that you are reading. It is always great to talk to someone who's already read that story. Or you can join or create a book club and read with someone else. You can also just tell people about the books you read. I have one friend who I always talk to about books. And we'll just tell each other what we're reading. And it just adds an extra element to the book. I like the stories more when I get to talk about them. So talk about them. What do you like? What do you not like? Always a good thing to do. Another thing that you can do that adds so much to your reading is to write about what you're reading. You might like to jot down little ideas as you go. That is an awesome way to keep your mind on the book. If you notice that a lot of your thoughts are these sort of distraction kind of thoughts that kind of pull you out of the book or tell you that you are out of the book, that you're not focused on it, not in a negative way, but they just tell you that, oh, your brain is somewhere else and you'll have to refocus yourself if you're going to get anything out of this story right now. If you notice yourself thinking these kind of thoughts, asking those kind of questions, taking a moment in that moment to say, wait, let's refocus and jot down something about the story I'm reading. What am I actually reading about? What's happening here? That can be a great way to sort of hook yourself back into the story. You might write a little bit more to reflect on really big moments. If something major happens, sometimes you gotta stop for a second and be like, what just happened? A character dies or some major thing goes on. I've had to put a book down and be like, what did I just read? You might write some to reflect on what just happened. And then when you finish the book, you might do something like write a review of the story and say, okay, here is what I think about this book. And actually, the process of writing that review can reveal so much and really help you dig into the story and really consider the story that you read. The books that I remember the most are the ones that I took the time to write a review for, to really think about, like, what did I think about that book? What did I like? What maybe did I not like so much? What did I think was, like, important from that story? We will talk more about some of these things as the year goes on, but I kind of wanted to give you a place to start with your thinking about reading. So if you notice that you are over here asking what's for lunch a lot, really take the time to try redirecting yourself. So when you notice yourself going, oh, how many pages are left? Say, wait, what kind of person do I think the main character is? And see if that helps you dig back into the book a bit. If you find yourself doing all of these other things that help your reading, amazing. Maybe try some of the questions that aren't quite so natural to you. Maybe it's super natural to you to ask about characters, to think about characters, but it's not so natural to you to think about the way the book is written or the themes of the book or the big ideas. So maybe you want to focus on that. Maybe you want to say, I know I really like these characters, but how did the author write this to make me like the characters? What about it do I like? How did they do that? And that can be a whole new way to look at the books that you're reading. So I know this is a lot. This is a big overview just to kind of get you started. But as you read today, think about these questions. When you're done reading, I'm going to have you jot a little bit about how that went. So what questions did you ask yourself? What did you notice yourself thinking about? What did you do when you noticed that you were thinking those things? So you can kind of have that in mind too while you're reading today. All right, have a wonderful day.